was not calm. Help! He was angry, he wanted in, he wanted out.
Many films have been about famous cases of bank robberies and how they left a mark on history. We have Dog Day Afternoon, Bonnie and Clyde, and then we have the stories that lead to deriving Stockholm Syndrome with a bank robber in Sweden. But can you imagine a story where an individual, basically a brilliant guy, got influenced by films to become one of the most infamous bank robbers in the world? Yes, this is the story of Scott Scurlock, and Netflix has just released a beautiful documentary about his exploits titled How to Rob a Bank. No, it is not a step-by-step guide, but it shows someone who figured it out and got away with it. Let's learn more about Scott Scurlock and its numerous exploits shown in How to Rob a Bank. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you, and let's begin.
And I heard 3 of the loudest booms.
What is How to Rob a Bank 2024 about? Netflix's latest production takes us to Seattle in the 1990s, and we go through the crime spree of a bank robber who managed to get quite the acclaim with his work, as he always managed to get away with it. How to Rob a Bank is a deep dive into the life of Scott Scurlock and probably his most exciting events in life, where he almost managed to become a modern-day Robin Hood with his work. While most documentaries like these will give us the perspective of the police who managed to get him, this time around we get a deep dive into the thief's life. But then it is equally interesting to see how the police figured out a way to catch this master thief in his work and predict his moves. Scott's partners in crime show up in the documentary and gives us an insight into the planning and the process behind their crime. It makes for a fantastic viewing experience, so we see the entire ordeal from the inside rather than the outside. If you thought movies like Heat 1995 or Public Enemies from 2009 felt cinematic, you should see how Scott managed to fool the authorities and figure out tiny loopholes against the authorities. This individual was influenced by the movies for these brilliant plans that proved quite adequate, even though they might look paper thin. He was later named Hollywood for his tactics, inspired by films like prosthetics for the face and extensive makeup. Unlike most other such individuals, we get to see Scott through archival footage that shows the side of him that we hardly get to see for such individuals in projects like these. It gives us his perspective, which seems filled with nuance of a being who is not just a thief who got lucky. Directors Stephen Robert Morris and Seth Porges did a brilliant job of bringing this story out of the records to show the world how far one man can go with his addiction to criminal activity. Filled with interviews from the authorities, Scott's accomplices, and journalists, hardly any point of view seems missing here. A tale that the locals of Seattle probably know comes out in a manner that will not be forgotten quickly. If you think this is just another bank robber story that should be remade into an action thriller type Hollywood project, wait until you hear more about Scott.
Robbing bank after bank.
3 or 4 banks, one right after the other in the same.
Who is Scott Scurlock? Scott Scurlock, or Hollywood as the media had coined him, was born William Scott Scurlock in Fairfax County, Virginia. Growing up into a handsome and intelligent individual, Scott had often been prone to find shortcuts to make money. A particular event from his childhood could indicate this path he would take as an adult. He and his friend were quite adventurous and always thought that what they were doing was for fun. But one time during his very early stages of lying and stealing, he stole a van from a local daycare center and drove it to the beach. In this case, even though it might sound very nominal, his family realized Scott was wrong. Now, the kid would grow up and move to Hawaii with his friend Kevin Mayers, who was studying at the University of Hawaii. Here he would work in a company called Hawaii Plant Life and Privacy Fences, but eventually he would begin his life of crime by developing an interest in marijuana plants. He managed to earn quite a reasonable sum when he sold some plants he had come across on a small farm and realized that this was easy money. But he would get caught when he tried to grow his plants secretly on a tomato farm, only to be found out by the landlord and being kicked out. Scott's story took an interesting Breaking Bad angle because there was a time when he managed to make methamphetamines in his school, Evergreen State College's chemistry lab. Back in 1978, it was a profitable move, but things would turn dark when the school kicked him out. But by then, he had managed to use the money that he had earned to buy a secluded piece of land in Olympia, Washington. There was a small house here that Scott used for meth production, and eventually he would end up building building a treehouse on the property. But it wasn't just any treehouse, since it was a 3-story structure with every possible modern amenity from a bathtub to a shower. This phase is an interesting one in Scott's life. He would grow some exciting friends with whom he would almost form a cult-like grouping. He would call them his tribe, as they were nearly ready to do anything for him. But there was a reason for that, and it was because he was equally dedicated to them when the chance came. Scott earned quite a lot with his illegal business as he lived a lavish life, including traveling, fine dining, and dropping $100 tips in restaurants. But then things took a turn when he found out that one of his significant distributors was killed, and he lost interest in the business as he realized it was pretty dangerous. This event and the need to find a new source of living and income led to what would make him a famous person around town.
A few days.
What he did, Scurlock's early bank robbing attempts, and the formation of his crew. According to Scott's friends, he had always planned to become a Robin Hood-like individual who would manage to change how money flows in the world. Eventually, he contacted his friend Mark Biggins, who had significant money problems and difficulty supporting his family. Mark owed Scott a favor for hiring Mark to work on his treehouse property, so Mark had to comply with probably the craziest job offer from it. Scott asked him to rob banks with him, and considering Mark's situation, it felt like a good solution. Now, 1991 was when the Catherine Bigelow-directed feature Point Break, featuring both Keanu Reeves and Patrick Swayze, was making waves. But while others were enjoying the film, Scott saw formula, a methodology for robbing banks. In some ways, Scott was Patrick Swayze with his chiseled body and dedication to himself. On June 25, 1992, Scott and Mark would don some masks and make their first attempt at the C First Bank in Madison Park neighborhood with a perfectly laid out plan that might sound absolutely bonkers to anyone else. The duo managed to rob the bank, take a car from one of the people in the bank or their getaway vehicle, and reach a particular location where they had ran another van. But upon reaching there, they found that the truck wasn't there, so they had to run across a golf course, leaving people confused about how to get the van and away. Their total steal was $19,971, and it was shocking that they had managed to escape the ordeal without a scratch. But the anxiety proved to be too much for Biggins, and he quit right after this. However, Scott had discovered his new adrenaline rush, and he was not going to give up anytime soon, which you might have observed based on his history of criminal activities. He continued with a series of thefts at the same bank, and later he hired his friend Kevin Mayers to work with him, offering him a sum of $250,000 for a single job. But Mayers declined. Instead, his brother Steve Mayers would join hands with Scott. Steve stated that the various plans and the entire process he and Scott went through to rob the banks were beyond art or anything he had ever done. The two worked together with Steve as the lookout, sitting in the car with a police scanner to make sure any update was being made to the police. If anything went wrong, he would signal Scott, and Scott would leave the job right away. They studied movements around the bank to pick banks and then attempt to rob them. But over time, they realized that the sum they were stealing was getting less with time and thus had to change their ways. So they took a woman's help to understand the bank's internals and how the vault works. This information proved helpful as they managed to score a sum of $252,000, which was a significant success. Unbeknownst to him, Scott was getting quite the reputation around the country, and the authorities were getting tired of losing the chance to catch this individual while he went around robbing banks. After all, he earned the title of Hollywood because of his typical mannerisms and the prosthetics he used. The meticulous process he used almost felt like he was anticipating the moves the authorities would make. This eventually led to them wondering if he was a police officer himself. Scott would rush into the bank in a mode that would immediately make the bank authorities realize that he was not afraid and eventually bowed down to him. But even then, Scott worked in a specific, predictable manner when selecting the banks and getting away. There were times when the duo was fortunate since the police had almost caught up to him. Once, as he was walking into the bank, someone identified him and notified the authorities, which rang up in the police scanners, and Scott was updated right away so that he could leave the job right then. It was almost as if Scott had his rules, which he would follow, and it wasn't about money at all because he found out that he was good at it. Another time, while Scott was in the car, the dye pack from the stolen money blew up, and Scott didn't think twice and threw away the bag and dumped the car. Now, Scott was known for carrying around his Glock 17 19mm pistol that he would use to hold up all of his robberies. When Michael Mann's Heat was released in the cinema halls, the shootout scene had quite an impact on him, and it almost felt like he had come to terms with the danger that this gig posed. Fans of Robert De Niro and Al Pacino might know that this scene from the film is often used to train officers due to its authenticity, but Scott had never harmed a single soul with his pistol, and it was something that he could never imagine to happen. For a while, it felt like his days of robbing banks were over until the police managed to use the media to make him famous, a psychological move that brought back most criminals back to their activities.
Hollywood was kind of predictable in terms of the times of day and where he would rob.
The final act. What happened to him? Now we come to the 27th of November 1996, the last attempt the group of individuals would make at robbing a bank. With Mark back in the team, the trio had decided to do a run that would involve taking on 5 banks in a single night. But they had to abandon the plan when they realized that the police had put electronic tracers on the banknotes, which would make it very difficult for them. So they went to a single bank, the Sea First Bank in Lake City, and got away with the money. After they got into their second vehicle, the van, they started digging through the money, looking for the tracers, and at the same time, the traffic also made it difficult for them to get away. At some point, police started to suspect a van that had torch lights moving in a particular manner in the back, and they decided to pass this information on to the other police officers. They were not taking this lightly. As soon as several police vehicles managed to surround this van, and as they've seen in Heat, they got into a crossfire when Scurlock pointed his gun at them. Both his accomplices were hit by the bullets, while Scott managed to get away in an alley nearby. The authorities wanted to follow him, but it proved to be too dangerous as Scott could shoot at them since they were going to be utterly blind to his presence. Instead, the authorities got hold of the accomplices and put them under arrest while making sure they both made it through. Now, it almost felt like all of this was over, but there was still one person out there who had narrowly escaped. Police went around the two looking for Scott and investigating where he could have hidden himself. The information was televised and people started reaching out with possible information regarding Scott's whereabouts and suspicions. But none of this information proved helpful until someone called it in, stating someone was hiding in their camper. Wilma Walker and her sons were preparing for Thanksgiving dinner, but then Ronald decided to go and check his camper, and that's when he caught a glimpse of the infamous Hollywood bandit. He informed the police right away, and the police surrounded the camper and tried to see who was inside by breaking the glass and throwing in 2 canisters full of pepper spray until they heard the sound of a single gunshot. They started shooting back at the camper with bullets bursting in through the glass until they could be sure that the suspect was dead. But when they went in, it turned out that Scott had used the Glock 17 to shoot himself before the authorities could catch him. This move aligned with one of his principles: live free or die hard. The FBI's most wanted never got caught in a way, and this would end up being one of the most significant cases of bank robbers in history. Both Steve and Mark would be sentenced to 21 years imprisonment based on the charges that made them some of the most prolific bank robbers in history. Marvelous verdict. Movies do have an impact, but the story of Scott Scurlock is nothing less of a film in itself, as he had his principles and did live up to them in his life of crime. The documentary reveals that the people surrounding him were utterly shocked when this information was revealed because they could not link him to such crimes. Unsurprisingly, Netflix made a documentary. Now, some directors will make a film out of this story, which will make for a good movie. After all, a thief inspired by some of the most significant robbery films ever makes for great Hollywood content. The pun is intended. If you like the content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.